Okay, firstly, what can I say? The obvious thing when we're talking about Robert E. Lee, for me, I grew up with him as a hero. I grew up in the era in the 50s. The Southern school was entirely dominant. Fortunately for all of us, this talk isn't about the politics of slavery or any of that. We're really looking at Lee, the military leader. I will make one observation that I came across that I found fascinating. In the beginning of 1860, there were 8 colonels in the United States Army who were from Virginia. Only one of them went south. I merely mentioned that in passing. And as far as it goes, that's as far as I want to go and delving into the politics. My real interest in Lee and in this talk, let's see, are we going to get this to work? Oops. Move for me, baby. Ah, your computer, sir, it speaketh not. Ah,
You don't seem to
oh, sorry. I'm being a fool.
have.
Let's get this. Where's the, here, go, you go. Let's get PowerPoint started up here. Ah,
It's how they.
let's hope for the best.
Press the wrong one.
Here we go.
No, the wrong one. Sit. Set.
Nope.
Yeah, that's right. One more.
Ah, hurrah. Okay. What I was really interested in is setting aside the politics. What you find is that throughout certainly the 20th century, Robert E. Lee was held in such high esteem across the US military. And that was as a general. Okay. Famously, Eisenhower traveled everywhere with his letter from Robert E. Lee framed, certainly in the Oval Office, and certainly when he was in Europe leading the Allied forces. And I attached a couple of pictures to see the kind of stuff that I grew up with. Literally, Lee was a hero. He was genuinely a man on the white horse. And as a very young boy, I found it difficult to separate Lee, the image of Lee, from George Washington. They were both these, and there's no doubt about it, Lee modeled himself on George Washington in the way he carried himself. But what I was particularly interested in was understanding how the more modern military actually analyzed what Robert E. Lee did. They thought he was great. That was a given. So why was he great? What were they looking at? And during the 1990s, you started seeing the field of knowledge management deeply affecting US military thinking, the training of officers, the training of senior officers, how they looked at tactics and strategy and so on. And really arising from the school of management thinking, which came up with mindfulness, we get this really. If you look at decision making on the battlefield, you're moving from a partial picture to, whoops, let's go back to that just for a moment, to you're moving from making sense to deciding what to do with that sense. And for that to do, you've got the important things to look at here is how do you make sense? And you do that by using the facts you've got, by gathering more facts, by manipulating the facts, manipulating the environment to suit yourself, and also by intuition. Those things together. And intuition is basically the application of your past experience to the present situation. This is so much like what happened last week, so I'll do the same again. Now, that is basically necessary because when we, are we still working here? Let's keep going. Yeah. So let's just consider the points of what we're looking at here. Firstly, when you're making a military decision, you've got to base it in the context of your strategic objectives, and they encompass more than military. Your aim isn't to win a battle, it's to win a war. Your main aim isn't actually to win the war, it's to win the strategic objectives for which your nation entered into that war. And strategy frames operations, and operations in turn frame tactics. Now, how does that look like? Let's take an example from World War II. Well, if it appears, there we go. Now, here's something. If we look at this is looking into the Pacific, the overall strategy to defeat Japan and defeat Germany, and that begat a Pacific Ocean strategy, and that you move through theater strategic to operational decision making to tactics which descend down to the lowest level. And ideally, the lieutenant leading the patrol, their actions are contributing to battlefield tactical objectives right the way up. But the main thing to note here is that it is very much top down. Overall strategy frames lesser strategies. Now, a lot of this, by the way, this thinking is clearly this has been established in World War II, this kind of approach. But a lot of this thinking, and the level we'll go into, it came out of, in fact, America's disappointing performance in the first Iraq War. When I began looking at this, it was primarily because I was working with IBM and members of the American military, and they were trying to apply the principles of knowledge management to the performance of officers in military situations. Now, let's apply it now to the Civil War in the mid-Atlantic states, Robert E. Lee at last. First thing I'd say here is I think from the very start, the overall strategic objectives of the South were very clear from everything Jefferson Davis said, and they didn't much change from it. Independence, leave us alone. Okay? And if you apply that Northern Virginia, again, straightforwardly, no rocket science here, secure unthreatened borders, and Richmond safe. Okay. But if we apply that down to the operational level, we start to look at why Lee entered Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. And then the Gettysburg battle, we start to run into problems and questions to consider. What ultimately were the operational and battlefield tactical objectives of the things he ordered done? And that's where we want to go. Now, why would this be relevant? Well, if you're trying to shape the ideal officer, you're looking at what they can do. And it's important here to bear things in mind. Ideally, the American military believes firmly you want fact-based reasoning. You don't want intuition. You want things based on all the information that you've got. Now, the best way to describe this is to consider how it fits together here. And why we want to study Lee in particular. I was a bit surprised by that. Let me go back up to there again. Say, firstly, is this the way? I think so. Cut out. Oh, well, we won't worry about it. We need to understand how commanders make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. And more than that, in conditions of change. I think the best metaphor I can use for it, if you imagine the jigsaw puzzle in front of a general, say Eisenhower in 1943, 44. He's only got so many pieces. He hasn't got all the pieces of the puzzle because he can't get all the information. He can't get everything that the Germans are doing and thinking. Equally, he has a problem in that the pieces only fit the puzzle in a time-limited way. Okay, so there are two challenges there. It's both complex and dynamic. So I've got a valuable jigsaw puzzle piece, but I'd better use it this week because it may not fit next week. Okay? And so applying that principle, now these are the sort of things we're trying to develop to understand we don't want an officer to be so wedded to reason-based decisions that they don't make decisions in a timely fashion, because reason-based decisions depend on getting the information and analyzing the information and reaching conclusions. And the more information you get, the better. The problem, of course, is, though, what happens with the gaps, because you never have all the pieces. And Robert E. Lee certainly didn't have all the pieces throughout his career, and yet he was enormously successful. I came with, frankly, a very northern view, which was very skeptical of the genius of Robert E. Lee. But actually, I came to respect it more and more when I applied this framework to it. I think he was a great commander, maybe not the greatest, a great commander nonetheless. However, there was always a problem. It's that lack of pieces. The jigsaw puzzle pieces that he had, he didn't always have them. He had to skate over the gaps. He had to fill the gaps with his intuition. And the problem always has been, and when we apply this in, say, the Iraq War or in Afghanistan, the Americans were deeply concerned about officers making decisions based on intuition because they didn't have facts. And when that happens, you're basing it on the past. You can't be certain they'll apply in the present. And you need to intuit because you never have all the pieces, but you need to be good at it. So here we go. Let's get used to where they keep pressing the wrong button here. So the combat environment. So what's involved here in the combat environment? The first thing they say, and this is applying, again, mindfulness principles to it, gathering information to enable fact-based decisions, okay, reason, making decisions based on facts, but, whoops, keep pressing the damn wrong button here. Not my computer. Skating over those gaps by applying your intuition. And if you do that, above all, and this is an important one we'll come to, being self-aware, recognizing the difference between decisions you've made based on facts and decisions you've made based on intuition. Now, we will get to Robert E. Lee eventually. I do apologize for this slightly long route, but I'm trying to look. I've based this paper primarily on looking at publications from the National Defense University and the various officer training colleges across naval, Army, and Air Force sources in the United States. And they really are concerned. The trouble with reasoning, as I just stated, structured logical analysis of complex conditions. It allows you to foresee everything, knock-on effects. You can make strong decisions, but reasoning requires enough time, trustworthy information. And let's just consider, it also enables, and again, the people who have these qualities, the generals who have these qualities, Robert E. Lee, you can think of it in terms of Lee, involving other leaders, building your own alliances. Again, Eisenhower's perfect example is, if you're familiar with the Second World War, enabling subordinates and directing subordinates. We'll come back to then. Again, those of you who are familiar with Robert E. Lee will again look at that and think there are ways in which he was extremely good at this and ways in which he was extremely poor at it. But Eisenhower is the best example of a reason-based general. Okay, all his military experience before he commanded Allied forces were peacetime. He was a peacetime general, He was part of the peacetime bureaucracy. He firmly believed in the power of reason. It's interesting because Lee was his great hero, that he was so unlike Robert E. Lee in so many ways. But nonetheless, what is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. And that, incidentally, applies so well to Europe in 1944. Because if you look at the European theater that Eisenhower faced in 44, you see a highly complex situation. But you don't see a dynamic one. Certainly not there. There was the British aircraft carrier, the opposite, the European wall. It was fixed. There was world enough at time where he had to take a chance. The big chance that Eisenhower took was choosing June 6th in view of uncertainty about the weather. But virtually everything else could be taken back to reasoned decision making. And that's a luxury that Robert E. Lee certainly didn't have. And so we ought to look somewhere else for that. The other side, effective intuition. Don't just sit there, do something, the famous 1990s mantra of management. And time is short, information is lacking. You've got to apply the past to the present. But the risks, you could be navigating with the wrong chart. And above all, player B may not play the same for you. And again, when we're nearly to lead, but we've got to stop. We're going to take a little bit to the side and consider Patton, who was in the Second World War in Europe, the ultimate intuitive general. Although you'll notice in the picture, I have found Patton opposite Monty, another extremely intuitive general. Now, think in terms of Patton. Patton was a highly effective intuitive decision maker. He didn't base his decisions when he prepared for Bastogne on information he had. He based it on instinct. Okay. Equally, Monty barreled British troops into Caen based on instinct, not on information. And in fact, in that situation, Montgomery made a pretty disastrous decision. So intuition is dangerous because if you apply the past to the present and you are wrong, you got nothing to go on. Okay? Now, let's move on from that to the last thing I mentioned, self-awareness. And self-awareness is important because it means you question yourself. And the primary example I could find of that, and we all will be familiar, anybody who's read on the Civil War will be familiar with, is Lincoln. In all his writings, they absolutely drip. His first efforts to apply ultimately operational strategic advice to McClellan and so on, he was so diffident in his writings. I beg you to consider. And even up to the point at Gettysburg, when his great disappointment in Meade after the battlefield, even then he held back. He was not a military man, and he knew it. And this important thing of recognizing your limitations. So again, we're talking about using facts and reasoning when you can, using intuition when you simply haven't got the facts, and being self-aware is being aware of the weaknesses of your approaches, in particular the danger that your intuition may be wrong. So those are the things that have been started being identified in the American military and applied to officer training. And the reason why Robert E. Lee has become so important in this is not because of his position as a great hero, but rather more because we know so very much about the minutiae of Civil War engagements, because virtually every literate soldier, from the lowest private to the highest general, was writing it down and sending it home to the newspapers or recording it afterwards and so on. And that's why Lee becomes so interesting to us, because we have so much information to look at as well. So here we go. So what was Lee standing on the eve of Gettysburg? Okay, you'll recognize the, I always get it confused. I always want to say Alexander Porter, Porter Alexander. I don't know why I always invert the names there. We look forward to victories under him as confidently as to successive sunrises. What a wonderful description of just what a hero he was. These are things that were recognized, indeed to be recognized today as great. He was superb in his interpretation of military intelligence. Above all, he read an awful lot of Northern newspapers. Okay, and he read up, he knew things. He knew, for example, how much McClellan overestimated the size of the army in Northern Virginia. Okay, something the Northerners simply refused to recognize. He knew. He was devoted to the offensive, and we'll talk about that. I think it shows that was frankly, that's a great strength. It certainly empowered the people who followed him, but it also, there's a great Achilles heel. He was brilliant in his use of logistics. Remember, his army always lacked resources, but he kept it in the field. Okay? And he was brilliant in his use of terrain, and above all, he was daring. And he was absolutely worshipped, therefore, by his subordinates, but also by his opponents. So much so that the final year with Grant didn't dent that. In 1865, Lee was as revered as much by his Northern opponents as by his subordinates in so many ways. Okay? Now, at last, we'll talk about where did Lee's approach come from. Now, he was indirectly descended, certainly had family connections to the father of the country, George Washington. And he very much modeled himself on George Washington. As I said, as a young boy, I actually couldn't tell them apart. You know, dignified man on a dignified old man on a white horse. You know, he was the marble statue man. Like Washington, he always sought the single decisive engagement. Now, if we're talking about anything, that is not based on reasoning. That is, we're now starting to talk about his personality. He presented himself as brave and dignified. He was brave and dignified. He was also, incidentally, when you read, vain. So he consciously presented a persona modeled on Washington. And he disliked intensely, just as Washington did, to following a Fabian strategy. Now that's based, we're going back to Hannibal, Fabius, and we're talking about Hannibal invading Rome. And this is the strategy of not directly challenging the invader. This is and Washington, in the way he kept the Continental Army alive, even though what he really wanted to have was that one decisive battle that would win New York and drive them out. He was forced by circumstances to hit and run. He hated it. He hated it in particular, if we go back further, because that's exactly what the Indians did when George Washington started the French and Indian War, because they simply wouldn't stand and fight him. Okay, so he really disliked this strategy, but he followed it very effectively in Northern Virginia, but he resented it. He resented it. And if we go on a bit further, some other things to get to, pressing the wrong button again. Damn. Okay, he was also, again, a man of his time, and that meant he was firmly a student of Jomini. Can't pronounce his name anyway, but I'll call him Jomini. There we go. Now, there are a few things to observe about Jomini. Jomini based everything on what Napoleon had done, well, primarily on what Napoleon had done. Napoleon's great campaigns, though, they were primarily offensive. That's truly important. Napoleon sought decisive engagements. Napoleon also was persuaded of the importance of places, and that deeply influenced Lee. And also, as we know, he was also a bit, in terms of following, he was also following them in terms of direct battlefield tactics. His tactics were dated by the Civil War because the technology that defined his tactics, and we're primarily talking about rifled gun barrels, meant that his battlefield tactics were dated and costly. And that ultimately proved crucial and distracted greatly from his other qualities in which he was extremely effective. Now, the Mexican War also defined him. There, he was given great scope at Mexico City, at the various places, great scope to follow his inclinations. His generals let him run with it. And there we saw that the use of terrain to hide audacious troop movements, the attack on Mexico City, is finding the pathway through the lava fields, if you're familiar with the Mexican. But he established an approach which he followed in the Civil War. And this is important. And of course, the Mexican War was very much a war that was won in decisive battle. And so that now we get to the Civil War. And the interesting thing here is that in terms of what established Lee's greatness, it didn't last very long. Really, Granny Lee took charge in the 7 days, not long, it wasn't that far back at Cheat Mountain, where he applied, incidentally, on a smaller scale, his favorite tactics that he would continue to follow afterwards. And in West Virginia, he was an utter failure. Okay? But his great time only lasted for about 13 months. Now, taking, again, a more modern perspective and applying the framework we talked about before of national strategic to battlefield tactics. And I know some of you are going to object to one or two of these assessments here. That's the nature of the beast, isn't it? And I showed a couple of Grant battles which took place at the same time. But the point here is to see, really, if you look at the theater strategic objectives for Lee, they were primarily unchanged. Everything revolved around protecting the northern border, protecting the capital. And his operational positions, if we take any of them, well, you see Johnston, unsurprisingly, you see defensive and defensive. But that also has to apply to Lee. And we'll look at each of these, or some of these battles more closely in a minute. And I've just, as I said, stuck in Grant for a bit. I think I won't say more about this. I'll let you use this for the questions and that, because you certainly want to disagree with me, I don't doubt. But that was his period of outstanding success. So let's start with the 7 days. Why did Lee become so effective in the 7 days? He certainly didn't succeed because of his battlefield tactics. Okay, and let's just consider what he was facing. Now, McClellan, his operational strategy, his theater strategy was superb. Okay, entering the Yorktown Peninsula, threatening Richmond, there is nothing to argue with there. But then you start to run into issues. Again, we talked about the need to make decisions based on facts. Well, his intelligence was entirely awful. Okay? Uh, he had no idea what he was facing. He vastly overestimated. He believed everything Pinkerton said. Equally, the Union cavalry at that time was hopelessly overmatched. Okay, and again, his battle tactics. He only attacked once. Now this is it: offensive strategy, but in the theater. But his tactics were very much defensive. He only attacked once. It was very half-hearted, and they pulled back. Arguably, they could have won the battle. But the point was, Lee and Little Mac agreed with each other. The South was winning. Lee was winning those battles, even though arguably Lee lost a lot. The point was, McClellan didn't believe that, and McClellan pulled back. So you could see very clearly he had this moral power over it. And look how it worked. His complex troop movements and attacks, I mean, these never worked. They never worked effectively in the 7 days. There were always failings. But as long as McClellan believed they worked, they did. Okay? And unfortunately, Lee did not critically look at what they actually achieved. Okay, this thing about self-awareness. And in the end, Mac had 100,000 men neutralized on the peninsula. So let's move on. Second Manassas. This is the one where you may object to defensive. It occurred to me. But what happened there again? Lee used Jackson to force an invading army to attack. And then, with Longstreet's arrival, destroyed the flank of that Union army and forced it to retreat back. A defensive battle. Okay? And it was a complete strategic and tactical victory. In some ways, for me, this is a more complete victory than Chancellorsville. But then we come to Antietam. Is again a great failing, again arguably a greater failing than Gettysburg in its own way, because it was at a time when it was far more likely that the South would have gained European recognition than in 1863. Okay, because it gave Lincoln the time to emancipate slaves. Crucially important. Okay? But again, if we look at it, what did Lee learn from this battlefield, which is the important lesson for us in reviewing what lessons there are for more modern officers looking backward? Well, unfortunately for Lee, so much of his thinking was affected by the lost order, because the 7 days and Second Manassas, so on, these things had very clearly established in Lee's mind a belief in his own superiority of command in the Confederate Army. Okay? He was better than the people he faced. It was no wonder after the war he called McClellan his most challenging opponent. He was his favorite opponent, and it seems very understandable that. But the fact is, you see, he was able to blame what happened at Antietam on the lost order. Now let's just think for a moment what Lee thought of the people he faced. Remember, this is what intuition comes from. You posit the present from the past. So what did he know? Virtually every commander he faced was somebody he taught at West Point. He knew them as human beings, and he knew them in the battlefield. And in every instance, What he saw were people who were timid on the battlefield. They were not decisive. And he firmly believed that that was who he faced. Okay, and that becomes very important. There's another factor in that that's worth thinking about. He also firmly believed in the superiority of his information because he believed in the superiority of his cavalry. And certainly at this stage of the war, they were very much superior. So he believed he had a knowledge advantage, and he didn't see it changing anytime soon. Because again, every new commander that appeared, Pope, his headquarters were in his saddle. These things affected his thinking. And at Antietam, he was very comfortable. And you see, again, look at the sort of thing Lee did. Lee engaged his entire reserve. After all, that's what a reserve is for. McClellan didn't. Again, that was partially down to the weakness because McClellan was defending Washington, D.C. But Lee had certainly committed all his reserves in the 7 days on the borders of Richmond, and certainly took chances, leaving Magruder and Huger, I can never pronounce that name, literally a curtain dividing him from Richmond. But of course, he knew McClellan, so he knew McClellan would not take that step. Now we come to Fredericksburg, where Burnside, rather like a rugby captain, with his head down in the scrum, we're going forward. Above all, by the way, again, a great victory, but a purely defensive battle fought in a purely defensive way, and made possible by the boneheaded leadership of the Army of the Potomac. And, the famous quote, "It is good that war is so horrible." One can't help, I puzzle over this because the contrast in the sentence is quite odd there. If it's horrible, why do we like it? Because it appears to be what, it was the very horror of Fredericksburg, it appeared to be what he liked. I'm confused by that one. And then we come to Chancellorsville. Again, famously, Joe Hooker lost faith in Joe Hooker. And I love this battle because this shows the classic characteristics of Lee doing what he learned to do from Jomini, what he learned to do from Washington, what he learned to do from his experience in Mexico, and what he failed to learn not to do because these same strategies were so less effective, say, in the 7 days. He split his army. He gave complex orders, right? And this is wonderful because it worked so well at Chancellorsville. First, he leaves virtually a tiny part of his army to pin the Federal troops in Fredericksburg. He takes the whole of his army around to confront Hooker, and then does the same thing again, splits the army and sends Jackson on his famous flank march. Now, he could only do that because of his firm belief that he knew who he was facing. He knew, and after all, what had he seen? Hooker aggressively crosses the Rappahannock and immediately sets up a defensive position, which was classic Army of the Potomac strategy at the time. And it invited Lee to think it's happening again. And he was right. It was. Jackson was actually observed by the Union forces on his flank march, but nothing was done about it. Okay, so he has his outstanding victory and loses Stonewall. But there were a lot of things happening at that time which should have been warnings to Lee that he needed to review his facts, that he needed to stop following his intuition, which told him, for example, that the North was overestimating his troop numbers. Because by this time, Hooker had reorganized the intelligence corps, And he knew that wasn't the case. And as we shall see, Hooker had also reorganized the cavalry, and that was going to be significant. He failed to recognize that the army he was facing was getting better because, as Hooker proved, it was badly led. And so we come to the eve of Gettysburg. What was in Lee's mind? Firstly, what would we say? His principles. Offense is the best defense, obviously. Completely confident in his intelligence advantage over his opponents, even though that was no longer true. Completely confident in his cavalry's superiority. Again, he had plenty of warning that that was not true. Because Brandywine, that was before he even launched his Gettysburg campaign. He was contemptuous of the Northern military leadership. After all, he had plenty of people who knew Grant personally telling him he's drunk. And also, he had contempt for the war in the West. And that's important too, incidentally. Lee believed in what he knew about personally. He didn't trust what came from the West. And he, above all, and by the way, we should bear some things in mind here, because we know from records of meetings he had with Jefferson Davis, but particularly with Longstreet, he very much knew that his victories were too costly. Right? He was aware that his army was declining relatively against the Army of the Potomac. But he remained wedded to this overwhelming belief in the decisive battle. And he was looking for it. And we'll talk about that when we get there. And I also want to mention as well this important fact: he was suffering from angina. He was in a foul mood. And it's very noticeable if you review Lee's performance around this time. He was very much shorter in his dealings with subordinates. His long debates and conversations with Longstreet were becoming shorter. He had less time. He was more likely to be impatient. He was hurting. And also, and this is interesting, because you remember when we talked about at the top, he had the full backing of Jefferson Davis. There were 2 votes of the cabinet about whether or not the Army of Northern Virginia should be allowed to enter Pennsylvania. Okay? And there were, and Davis wholly supported, and this is really interesting, because if you look there, it becomes very hard to believe that the Confederate government was setting the overall strategic framework. It reads very much more that Lee was imposing a strategic vision on the Confederate States. More that than anything else. I don't think there's any way else you can explain the unwillingness to move troops west. His unwillingness to do more for Vicksburg. It was in Virginia where Lee would relieve Vicksburg. Purely coincidentally, he got the whole of his army, and it was all under his control. And again, by the way, you've seen these sheets. These kind of things are produced for schools. And I only mention it in passing just because I found them very amusing. But they do thought, if he's that much of a hero, I'm not going to question him. And certainly by then, Jefferson Davis wasn't going to question him. He did what Robert E. Lee did. He personified the Confederacy. And so therefore, Lee was actually, although it was never clearly stated, Lee was imposing a strategic vision on the whole of the South. And so what would these are the justifications he made in what was published, what he wrote: threaten northern cities and pro-war sentiment. There was no argument in the South about that, very much so. The Democrats were a real threat. Gain European recognition. Again, by the way, these are not coincidentally, the Confederate strategic aims very much mirror the Revolutionary War strategic perspective. In other words, again, we go back to Washington. Lee was seeing himself in the Washington role. He was going to make the South survive long enough for the Europeans, in this case, the British and the French, in the same way Washington kept the revolution alive until the French effectively rescued it. He of course had to feed and replenish the army, because Northern Virginia had been under the cosh, and force the Federals to abandon the Vicksburg campaign. And of course, the interesting thing here is that was always an add-on. It was never really believable, as indeed the Vicksburg campaign was virtually over before Chancellorsville, arguably, but certainly before the Pennsylvania campaign. And again, this idea of meeting the Army of Potomac on grounds that Lee chose, and implicit in all that, and not very well hidden in his writings, was his personal objective, which was the complete destruction of the Army of the Potomac, which frankly has no place in the overall strategy. And very much was, according to Longstreet anyway, was kept in the background because when Lee convinced Longstreet to support him in this endeavor, Longstreet always was very clear. It was very much on the understanding that if we are forced into full battle, it will be defensive. Okay? And it's difficult, of course, with Longstreet to know what to believe or not to believe, but I think there's enough evidence to support that. And so now we come to a lovely picture. So let's take that strategic framework and apply it to Gettysburg. As we said, overall aim is unchanged: independence and therefore recognition. Northern Virginia, unchanged objectives. Invasion of Pennsylvania, again, consistent with their objectives. But the Gettysburg battle sits very oddly in that, because if you're talking about each of these layers imposing a framework within which the next layer happens, the Gettysburg battle is difficult to fit in. And there was a lot of opposition to it. And there was a lot of discussion in the South in the period leading up to the battle. And here we have what Beauregard had to say about it. He obviously didn't have all the details. He didn't know about Pennsylvania. He thought it was another Antietam type entry. Is it going to end the struggle, take Washington, or save the Mississippi Valley? Even by then, it was pretty clear to others that there was a lot about this invasion. Some have talked about it as a raid in force, but there was a lot about it that left people uncertain. And there were particular problems with the invasion that need to be considered. Firstly, as we know, at Chancellorsville, he lost Stonewall Jackson. Now, again, a moment here when we're talking about the managerial approach that a general can take. He famously trusted his generals above and beyond the levels of trust. My job is to put these people in the right place and then get out of the way and let them do their thing. Now, you could do that with Jackson, although, again, if you want to review the history of Jackson's various actions, he didn't always succeed. his outstanding successes were against the most mediocre of mediocre Union armies, that being in the Shenandoah Valley, and an army led by Pope. Okay, but it is worth saying. Sorry. Okay. He was really good at island number 10. But remember, by the way, again, we need to think about the victory over Pope. Lee firmly believed in the inferiority of the Western Union commanders too. And he applied that same thinking to Grant. Although if he had thought it through and had people working with him, they might have pointed out that Pope became commander of the Union forces after one battle. Grant had consistently delivered success. So at the very least, there were quite a lot of reasons why he should have had more respect for the improving quality of Northern leadership. But as I said, he taught them all. Grant was a very poor student. So here we go. And of course, Grant wasn't even on the scene as far as we're concerned, so I'm getting ahead of myself. And we shan't be talking about the Overland Campaign, but there we go. That's just so much you can talk about. But he had reorganized his army, and he was still treating these people as if they were people he could trust. Okay? He didn't command, he suggested. And really importantly, they had no rules of engagement. From a modern perspective, with Hill, Longstreet, and Ewell so spread out across Pennsylvania with no rules of engagement. Okay? And we'll talk about the battle itself, but a particularly important thing here as well, because the lack of strategic thinking when Lee got into battle mode. You know, the implications of winning, because every victory they had left a very powerful Union army still nearby. What would he have done if he'd won there and Meade had just pulled back to Cashtown? The operational issues. He started it too soon after Chancellorsville. Again, the unclear objectives. The logistics, which we'll talk about in more detail. Enormous supply trains. They had to keep moving to live off the land. And so avoiding battle was essential to his logistical model. What's interesting here, by the way, is he had the same challenge that Grant was, a similar challenge to Grant's challenge in central Mississippi. Okay? But it's interesting that Lee came to a different conclusion than Grant, because Grant wasn't afraid to fight battles of movement. And at Gettysburg, Lee was. But we'll talk about that in a moment. The logistical issues. Key point here, because they couldn't bring as many wagons, because they had too far to go, they didn't have the ammunition they needed. They had lots, by the way, of short-range artillery. Had they been attacked, they were well equipped to defend. But they lacked shells in enough quantity to seriously, ultimately, to attempt to suppress the Union artillery at Gettysburg. They didn't have the shells. They had plenty of grape shot, or its equivalent. And the key issue there is he did have some cavalry, and by the 2nd of July, he had all his cavalry, but he did not use his cavalry to do more than the cavalry Imboden was primarily focused on guarding the supply trains. There was very little of the scouting function done. We'll talk about that. And the reconnaissance and screening issues. Well, Brandy Station. Okay, the key point there is Brandy Station should have told Lee 3 weeks before Gettysburg that the Union cavalry was a different beast. But he failed to learn that lesson. He was still wedded to his history. His intuition trumped facts that were available to him. If you read his orders, whatever disappointment he felt about Jeb Stuart, his orders to Stuart virtually invited him to ride around the Union Army and encouraged him to bring all the supplies he could. Things which played a crucial effect on, Lee was unable to screen his army and he was unable to scout the Union Army, partially because he just didn't trust Imboden. And as for the cavalry he left behind guarding the fords, they were West Virginian and Virginian irregulars. He didn't trust them either. Okay, the Northern Army wasn't the only one which had a West Point bias. Okay, and finally we come to the battle. As we said, no rules of engagement. Heth is advancing towards Gettysburg, and well, it wasn't inconsistent with the strategy for gathering throughout, but it certainly wasn't an offensive or even a defensive maneuver particularly. And the battle was something they drifted into. And that's very clear in the way, despite everything, on the first day, Hill and Ewell's troops bundled the Northern troops through the town and out the other side. But there wasn't ultimately a clear objective. And that proved crucial. Then we come to our second day. And what can we say about the second day? Again, by now, seriously, much has been made of what Longstreet didn't do. And we can look at the commands that were sent out to Ewell and Hill and Longstreet. Remember, Lee was traveling with Longstreet for the whole of that day. He was with Longstreet. So there was plenty of opportunity for Lee to correct Longstreet. Equally, Longstreet and Hood, and for Hood to question Lee, it had to be a pretty strong reason before Hood would ever question Lee. They were saying, swing around wider. Come wider on the flank. And Lee absolutely wouldn't. He had the cavalry to scout that position on the second day. He didn't use it. Okay. Now, something they talk about in modern military training with a commander is knowing when you've reached the offensive culmination point, the point at which attack ceases to be worth the risk. When loss becomes too costly and even winning can be difficult. And arguably that happened on the second day. Certainly Longstreet was arguing that way. So again, isn't it nice to have a talk that doesn't spend endless time talking about this field and that field? I hope you appreciate that. We aren't going into the wheat field or the peach orchard, but we're going to consider some of the things that were said at the time. I think that this is the strongest position on which to fight a battle that I ever saw. It's my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position. That's pretty strong. Now, remember, at this stage, Longstreet was arguing for pulling the Confederate army around and moving to the left. And this was to force the Union to abandon that position and attack the Army of Northern Virginia. In other words, turn the battle into a Confederate defensive battle, which was, after all, Longstreet says, was why he agreed to support Lee in this campaign in the first place. But Lee absolutely wouldn't have it. Again, he has a reasonable argument in some ways, because he was afraid that the Union would be too slow to attack him and he'd run out of supplies. Okay? So there were reasons for it. But anyway, the Union Army, the interesting thing for me, by the way, is you could argue at this stage we're moving into a reverse Fredericksburg. And again, that was a battle where Lee had fought. And that was a battle where the lessons he learned were not the lessons he might have learned. And it points to the strength at which we hold tight to what we know from the past. You still have an excellent opportunity to move around to the right and maneuver him into attacking us. And of course, we all know from our Killer Angels about Garnett and Lou Armistead, the doubts they had. And then we come to the third day, okay? By the way, if you look carefully, you can see the elastic cord by which that poor fellow appears to be blown in the face is getting pulled back. If you look very carefully, you can see it just at that point. There you go. But it's certainly vivid, you know. And then we come to Pickett's charge. And at this point, really, there's no justification. There's just no justification on any grounds except his absolute firm belief that he could succeed. This was his primary objective since he'd started, to destroy the Army of the Potomac. He couldn't resist. And afterwards, you get Lee at his most honest for a short time. The fault is entirely my own. And of course, Pickett agreed with him. Entirely. Okay? And Porter Alexander makes the point, Longstreet obeyed reluctantly at Gettysburg, and he owed it to Lee to be reluctant. I think that's a beautiful quote. And from the Confederate cabinet, you have Hosea Gorgas. You know, this destroyed the Confederate belief that they could win. The saddest day of my life. And now we get Lee starting to equivocate a bit about it's all my fault. Speak to me, come on, slideshow. Here we go. Yeah. The battle was commenced in the absence of correct intelligence. It was continued in the effort to overcome the difficulties by which we were surrounded, and it would have been gained could one determined and united blow have been delivered by our whole line. I'm going to take each of those lines and just comment on it. In the absence of correct intelligence, well, whose fault was that? Okay, even by the 2nd of July, he could have known more. Okay, I can't hide that. And by the way, I admire him. He was so successful leading up to this. It just makes, in some ways, the failings, the lack of mindfulness in Lee, all the more instructional for officers of the future. It was continued in the effort to overcome the difficulties by which we were surrounded, but incidentally, difficulties of which they were aware before they ever left Virginia. They were foreseeable. And it would have been gained could one determined and united blow have been delivered by our whole line. Well, somebody has to find me even one battle during Lee's golden period in which his complex commands resulted in timely and coordinated activity by the disparate forces that he set going. It never happened. But he never stopped believing that it could happen. And incidentally, he never wrote orders that might have forced it to happen. Because even after, we can say after Antietam, he was afraid to write out orders. But even before Antietam, when he did write out orders, they were pretty much, I hope you'd like to attack. You might consider the advisability. He invited people to delay. And these were new corps commanders in some cases. I was too weak to defend, so I attacked. Again, I look at his readings and I think, I'm inclined to attack anyway, It just was there. It was in his personality. He was so much more like Patton than Eisenhower, wasn't he? And here we go again. Damn, I'm so bad at getting this slideshow to listen to me. There we go. Now, a modern tool, FAS, feasibility, acceptability, suitability, is a quick shorthand way for commanders in a battlefield situation to assess things. Feasibility, can the action be taken? Well, there is no evidence at the time of any activity to make it a feasible thing, his attack. They drifted into it. As we said, Heth marched there. Ewell's troops came down from the north, and they kind of flowed into an attack. It happened. Now, there were things one could do if one was seeking battle. One could have sought a more favorable terrain, or one could have tried to affect the Union troops and the Union movements so as to make things more favorable. Acceptability, and that's about the cost. Okay, and this is again something you're asking military leaders to consider. Will the cost of the action be justified? And remember, I talked to you earlier about the offensive culmination point, the point where you recognize that it isn't an acceptable action. And finally, we come to suitability. And what would Confederate victory have accomplished? It's highly uncertain. Unless it was the absolute crushing victory that simply wasn't going to happen under any conditions. He wasn't going to destroy the Army of the Potomac. He might well defeat it, send it back, but it would still be there, bigger than his own army. So on all those grounds, you have to question decisions he made between July 1st and 3rd. You really do. And I just remind you of those things if we look again. That's okay. That was people getting ready to throw, for the Zoom people, starting to throw things. Anyway, there we go. Anyway, if you look at it now, the Gettysburg battle simply has no place in the decision framework. It's really hard to work out why the battle had to be fought. And that left me with the thing, what did we learn looking at this? And I'm really leaning on far better thinkers than I, the military thinkers writing in the various National Defense University publications and so on, and also their dissertations and so on. Couldn't expect me to come up with this clever stuff. Anyway, he had this wonderfully inspirational leadership style. Nobody can take that away from him. He was rapid in his analysis of battlefield conditions. He was very decisive. Not always in ways we'd like, but he was decisive. And when he had information, he used it well. He just didn't always recognize when he didn't have it. He was bold in the face of superior forces. That's how he got as far as Gettysburg. He used fixing attacks, and he split his forces in ways that are still taught today. But again, we run into this thing, dismissive of opposing leadership. He should have learned better on that count. It wasn't so decisive in this case. We didn't advance, but it was very important and progressively becoming more important. And of course, we've commented on his orders, vague and discretionary, minimal oversight of tactical operations. If he was so upset about the lack of coordination that cost him the battle, why didn't he do something about it when he was actually with Longstreet? And so it's interesting to look at the American military thinkers when they're commenting on it, because while he's still for many a great hero, they can't get away from it that his flaws overpowered it. He was not another Napoleon. He was not even another Grant. He was, in many ways, a great commander. But as with the quote that I started from, Robert E. Lee was the price the South paid for Robert E. Lee. His failings were as important as his leadership qualities and success. Anyway, I've got the bibliography at the end. As I notice people taking pictures, I'll just say I'm happy to share this with you. And I've marked in orange, if you look at this, the papers I found the most interesting, and in some cases quite difficult to find, but they're pretty apparent on the internet. You know, I'm a lazy chap. I like to stay up in North Nottinghamshire and look at a computer screen rather than travel to libraries around. But what's interesting is you'll get an idea of how modern managerial thinking about mindfulness, knowledge management, the framework of strategic to operational to tactical, how these things inform the way they teach officers today. I just found it fascinating to apply it to Lee, and I was left respecting him more than I had in the past, but appreciating more directly his failings too. I don't think there's nothing black and white, forgive me, about Robert E. Lee. Anyway, thank you. That's all I got to say.